So what we're going to do now, we have a panel from Reach that is going to talk about how property industry can create better customer experience with technology. So this panel is going to look at the way as in which technology can help agents to shape unique and fulfilling customer experiences, with an emphasis on how technology can help agents to attract, engage, and retain new customers. Very important, of course. Moderator of the session is Dan Weisman. He is Director of Emerging Technology Trends at the National Association of Realtors in the USA. Dan, are you here?
I am. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, cool. And you brought some people with you, as from Goor, Shakil Hussein, Alex Leduc, and Jason Harris. I hope they're all here.
They are. I see them all. Yeah.
That's great. Well, I'll give you the floor, and I hope you make it an amazing panel altogether.
Great. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody around the world. Good morning here in Chicago, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. Very, very excited to be here. A couple things. I want to first of all thank Global PropTech for having us. We're just couldn't be more excited about being part of this discussion, which is so critical. And then also, obviously, as mentioned, the Reach UK program, who helped orchestrate all this and has a great relationship with the Global PropTech organization. Reach UK is part of the National Association of Realtors venture arm that also is a scale-up program. Some of the companies folks you'll hear from today are part of that program. So very excited to have them and talk all about this customer experience. As we all know and have seen with this pandemic, expectations have changed significantly. And we have relied more on technology than I think we ever have before. And there's billions of dollars being invested into the technology space, ultimately to help make the process of real estate and transacting and interacting more efficient for everyone involved. As we all know, the process may feel a little bit clunky. There's many pieces and parts to pull together, and it can be very overwhelming. And when you take that combined with the pandemic, plus the billions of dollars being invested, it's hard to sometimes know where to begin and what you should focus on when it comes to helping to ensure that ultimately the client customer experience is amazing, and that there's transparency and efficiency in what everyone does. And so today, as I mentioned, we have this great panel, and the goal really is to talk about this, talk about the customer experience, the client experience, talk a bit about kind of the overall process in our respective countries and what we're seeing around the globe, and then chat a bit about where we think we can make improvements and how we can make them. Through the three things that I always focus on as Director of Emerging Tech at NAR is really the people, the process, and the technology. How do we pull all those things together to ultimately have that amazing experience and as few complaints as possible as we go through the challenge of buying, selling, and renting homes and properties. As I was introduced, I'm one of the directors of Emerging Tech. My role at the National Association of Realtors is to ultimately look at and understand what technology is out there and how it may impact specifically our membership here in the US, but I then have the pleasure of working across the globe with our Reach programs as well, which is our scale-up program, as I mentioned earlier. So again, very excited to be here and look forward to the conversation. I'd like to do some really quick intros because I know we all want to get to the kind of the meat of this conversation, but I obviously want to give everyone an opportunity to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about them, their company, and then also where you're located, where you're doing business, and where you want to do business. So I'd like to start with Hess.
Hey guys, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Fantastic. All right, I'll keep it brief. I'm the COO of Search Smartly. We are a UK-based property matchmaking portal, and our goal is really to take the pre-qualification pain out of the transaction by qualifying applicants better. So that's it.
It has remind everyone, where is your company based out of? Where are you doing business? And okay, great, thank you. Let's go to next one on my screen. Shaq.
Hey guys, I'm Sharik, CEO of Residently, currently also living in a Residently property based in London. We're headquartered there with a tech base in Manchester. We have global ambitions. We have a small pilot that we had in New York. We're building the next generation rental marketplace where you can search, reserve, manage, renew, and move again all seamlessly within our network. We partner with realtors, agents, property managers, and institutional owners to serve the market. Our product is a super app for renters and a tenancy or renter management SaaS platform for property partners, and we're on a mission to unlock the freedom of renting.
Great, thank you. Alex.
Right. Good morning, everyone, or I guess depends on the time zone. But so my name's Alex. I'm CEO of Perch. We're based out of Toronto here in Canada. We operate only in Canada, and we help homeowners build wealth through real estate. So whether that's first-time home buyers getting into the market sooner and faster, or existing homeowners putting their home equity to work, we work with our consumers to add value from a financing side of things. And then we work with a network of realtors and wealth advisor to mutually help that client to make even more out of their transaction.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And last but certainly not least, my friendly neighbor, Jason.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Harris. I'm the CEO of Cardo Front. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. We are simplifying insurance for real estate transactions. So we're embedded in the US in 4 markets within the multiple listing services. Our first product is regarding flood insurance, which, as many people know, is a real issue, especially in our Florida markets, and it's a global issue. We'll be expanding to homeowners and then ultimately to wildfire products as well in the US. We're based in Chicago. We are exploring opportunities globally through our friends at Reach in the UK, as well as Reach in Canada and potentially in Australia. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Great. So let's get started. I want to talk kind of at an overall high level. The market has just been all over the board. It's completely taken off. And one thing that I love to do as I have these conversations is, I feel like I'm very heavily focused, obviously, here in the US and on the market, and I follow that closely. And I don't always pay attention to the rest of the world. And part of why I love these panels is I get to learn about what's happening across the world in a bit more detail from folks that are actually sitting in those countries. And so I want to start off by talking a bit about what you're seeing in your particular market. I want to hear a bit about kind of where things have been, where they are today, where you think they're going. And obviously the economy is having significant impacts. For example, here in the States, our interest rates have gone up significantly. During the pandemic, they were 30-year mortgage for 2.5%, maybe even less at some point. And now they've quickly risen to 5%, which don't quote me on this, but our chief economist, I believe that adds close to $400 to $600 per month, US dollars, for someone who now wants to buy a home, which is a significant amount of money. And so I'd love to learn a bit about, from Hess and Shaq, we'll start with you guys, just the UK market and what you're seeing from obviously the impacts from the pandemic, from the economic roller coaster we've been on quite a bit. So Shaq, why don't we start with you? Could you talk a bit about the UK and just kind of what you're seeing and the economy as a whole and the rental versus maybe buy space? Just explain a bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, Residently is focused on the rental space, so I'll comment a bit more in there and let Hess talk a bit more about the buy side as well. From our vantage point, what we're seeing obviously over the last couple of years, it's been a real crazy time. The rental market went through quite a lot of transformation with COVID, with the need for everyone to really start to embrace a lot more digital technology, focus on things like virtual viewings. And as we kind of came out into slightly, better times, it was an extremely hot market in the UK with rapidly rebounding rental prices going well beyond what was there pre-pandemic. So it was a super hot market. And now with kind of global, economy starting to cool off, that's starting to ease off. Now that kind of phase was quite transformative from the perspective of adoption of technology and focus on the customer experience, where previously you didn't necessarily really need to focus on that when you rode the wave of an ever increasing a hot rental market, and all of a sudden there was a need to operate digitally, remotely, and facilitate all these things during COVID. And then now that we're heading into another new environment where, since post the bull run of 2008, finally cost efficiencies and managing all of that is more important than ever. There is a lot of focus on looking at the customer experience and looking at efficiency from what we're seeing.
And I find it interesting because here, and I'll just speak specifically, obviously, to the United States, is houses are selling and renting in 24 hours, and there are like no contingencies. People are just letting everything go. So part of me is like, you almost don't even need technology to make that happen in terms of when you're talking customer experience, because the customer experience happens in 12 hours, right? Although I think there's a lot of technology that helps execute on that, right? And I think as things, as you mentioned, Shaq, things cool down a little bit, clients and customers are going to have even more time to think about that experience, and will give them time to actually want to make sure that they're using the right people, process, and technology to ultimately have an experience in getting a home, whether it be buy or rent, that they're really happy with. And so, Hess, I'd love to hear a bit about the both the rent and the buy market in the UK and kind of what you're seeing as well, please.
So we serve a home market, although our sort of primary customer base is still urbanites. What we are seeing is, I would say, an essential split within the market. So we see very high value urbanites, professional urbanites, draw an awful lot of attention within, for example, the build to rent / multifamily space, the rent to rent market, because obviously they have budget and these people are extremely in demand. And we see property as a service kicking off in the UK, really focusing on this crowd with the underlying sort of belief that, hey, if you get this right, if you get your positioning right, they will stay with you for life. That is on the rental side. Now, deal throughput for that side of market is interesting because obviously there's fewer applicants, and the majority of the market, I would say, are mid-market applicants for whom there's a scarcity of properties in this country. We have seen landlords close up shop due to heavier regulatory costs, heavier regulatory burdens, and that is continuing to increase. So government spending, government regulation is going off. And obviously there's a continuous rotation of housing ministers in this country. On the sales side, we see similar sorts of dynamics. The market essentially had a miniature explosion in terms of pricing shortly after COVID. We had the stamp duty freeze for a while, which was really incentivizing people to buy. But again, average buying prices in this country in terms of first-time buyers continue to go up. So it's just been very difficult for people to get onto the housing ladder. And for us, what we're seeing is a lot of deals falling through. So essentially a big pain point in this market is people come in, they make an offer, and then the paperwork, the legals, and all of the other sort of pieces that come and sit behind that offer essentially cause a transaction to fall through at a later date. And that is a huge issue over here.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good transition because although I've talked a bit about the US market, I want Jason's thoughts on it as well. But inventory obviously is a huge topic of conversation. So Jason, what's going on in the US, and what are your thoughts on kind of just the market as a whole, where things have been, where you think they're going?
Yeah.
Love to hear about that.
Yeah, similar in the US as to global, right? So there's a very limited amount of supply. Well, there had been, right, because of COVID. A lot of people coming out of populous areas to kind of secondary, tertiary areas where they could downshift and still have the ability to work or have whatever at their disposal, those with the wherewithal to do that. First-time home buyers really struggled because a lot of people came in with cash, and markets like Miami were just absolutely blowing up with global focus. So back to Dan, your comment a little while ago, I come at it from an insurance point of view, right? So I'm a conduit to the insurance markets. And if you're waiving a contingency or you're waiving an inspection, you're at super risk, right? You want to get into that house because you're one of maybe 5, 10 or more people trying to buy that property and overpaying for it. You know, you're buying something that could have all sorts of risk, could be sitting on a floodplain in our world, et cetera. A lot of risk with that. So the fact that interest rates are going up, the market's cooling, I think cooler heads will prevail. People still need to get the right experience. Now, one other piece I want to mention is in the US, in some places, specifically Florida, California, and Texas, which are the most populous, largest states and also have climate risk. There's also climate impact on insurance. So the insurance fees for base homeowners to own, to get coverage for your ownership is jumping through the roof. And so your total dollars for buying a property, you might have been, to your point, $500-600 US, with the new mortgage rates. Your insurance rates also are way up. And so you might be able to buy, you might have been able to buy a property a year ago at 500,000. Your dollar might only go 400,000 now because of increased mortgage and increased insurance costs. So your total, ability to purchase something is now diminished along with all the competition.
Yeah, and one thing I read the other day is there was a study done, and I think it's something along the lines of 75% of people who have bought homes during the pandemic, they have some regret.
Yeah.
Whether it be location, whether it be they waived their home inspection, and now all of a sudden they have all these unforeseen expenses. It's a real challenge that with this push and high demand and low supply, that's become probably not the experience that many have wanted. And I think we're hopefully on the tail end of kind of this big push, and that there will be an opportunity to clean that up a little bit so that people understand the overall picture of what it looks like to buy, sell, or rent a home.
Two other quick notes, and then I'll pass it to Alex. One is, I think it's going to be an interesting trend to see if people in the next year or two turn around and put their properties back on the market because they have buyer's remorse, right? I think there'll be some sort of directional trend there. The other piece in the US, which I think is a global issue as well, is large private equity firms or private institutional buyers are buying homes at an increasingly crazy, clip. So it's like, I think in the US, it's like 33 to 35% of all single family homes are owned by some sort of institutional buyer. I'm talking, they're accumulating individual onesies and twosies all over, zip codes or whatever, postal codes that they choose. That trend is not turning around anytime soon, right? You're going to be buying from some institution between you and getting your purchase of more. You're going to be buying from some institution that owns that right.
Yeah, totally. So Alex, let's pull you into this conversation because I'd love to hear a bit about the Canadian market. I'm hoping it's doing better than your Toronto Maple Leafs did in the playoffs. Sorry, I had to get you on that one. I know, just setting them up. The Blackhawks, Chicago Blackhawks, didn't even
don't even go there.
Anyway, all right. So Alex, so let's talk a bit about the Canadian market. Love to hear, similar to the conversations we've been having so far, just what you're seeing in the past couple of years, where things are today, and where you think things are going.
Yeah, so I'll echo a lot of the same trends, and yeah, no hard feelings. I'm not a very sports fan, don't follow a lot of it, but essentially a couple of years ago we had record low interest rates. Like I remember we were even doing like fixed rates in the 1.6% range. So the Canadian mortgage market is a bit nuanced compared to other markets in the sense that we do 5-year terms predominantly. Versus in the States, and I'm assuming probably also in the UK, it's 25 or 30-year amortizations, which matches your term. So the issue that we're going to have in Canada, and to me, it really relates to the supply side of things, is that with rising interest rates, if you had locked in a 30-year mortgage, you still have your rate, but in Canada, every single mortgage holder is going to come up for renewal within the next 4 years into a higher rate. And then on our end, we're doing the math. It's like an average increase of about $800 a month for mortgage payments. So it's not insignificant. So you're going to see that component of it was going to influence a lot of behavior. So you might see a lot more re-amortizing because increasing your amortization can lower your payment. You end up in the same place. You might see some more HELOCs kind of converting your mortgage into an interest-only payment thing. So people, I think, have a good amount of cushion just because if you bought a property in the last 2 years, you probably have a pretty significant equity gain that you can lean on because our average HPI growth was about 25%, I think it was the last year over year. So you have some protection in regards to anybody who's an existing homeowner, but what's going to happen as it relates to supply is you're going to have a lot of people who don't even qualify for the home that they're currently in. Which means that if you were thinking of moving or moving up, that's not even an option for you anymore. So you're going to stay put, which restricts a lot of the resale. But then if you look at demand, we're looking to double immigration. We've got a ton of people who haven't even gotten into the market yet. We've got a lot. We've got housing, we have lower resales. Last month, I think year over year, our housing starts are down 38%. We have a tight labor market, increasing supply prices. So there's a lot of things to me that point to a tight supply market that's going to continue. And then we have an increasing amount of demand that's not going to really settle down. So there's a lot that's going to be going towards how do I get into the home that I want? So you're going to see a lot more loans from the bank of mom and dad to get your down payment to 20%. You're going to see co-ownership, maybe even fractional ownership. A lot of these methods where people are trying to find ways to get into the housing market because the demand is still very strong as it relates to the market. So I guess, I think I see a lot of nodding heads. So I think it's similar trends globally.
It's interesting, Alex. I guess I didn't realize that the mortgages are 5-year terms. And so that, I can imagine the position that people are going to be put in, when, they're 4.5 years, 5 years in, figuring out what they're going to do when rates have changed, life changes, everything changes. And to hear $800 a month increase, that's not $20. That's a lot of money. And so it leads me, you just mentioned a number of things that anyone who's kind of in our space understands in terms of HELOC and different loans and how you navigate this space. And one thing that I want to obviously focus on in this conversation is around transparency, the customer experience. And I think a lot of us who are living and breathing these conversations on a daily basis take a bit for granted what the average consumer or client fully understands and all the options that they may have, because at some point there's going to be millions of people who come up against this wall where they're maybe not in the best financial situation because of all the things we just chatted about. And so I kind of want to shift into talking about where there are gaps that we see coming and how do we focus on, again, this customer experience. And as we talked about before, just transparency seems so key in whether or not a potential renter or buyer necessarily wants to uncover their ears and actually hear the fact that they need flood insurance. They need to understand the cost of regular maintenance on a home, or who's responsible for the gas and electric bill on a rental property. all of those things start to add up to hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And I think things have been moving so fast recently, as we've chatted about, that many times those kind of get looked over. And then all of a sudden you're in a home or you're in a rental property and you're starting to get these bills. And what used to be $2,000 a month now is somehow $3,000 a month. And so let's talk a bit about kind of how do we create this transparency? Where are the things that as people are looking to buy and rent or sell, where they get close to the end of that process and they get caught up, or they get in that home and all of a sudden they have all these additional expenses and they kind of have this sour taste in their mouth and they're in a really bad position. So I'd love to talk a bit, and I'll go back to Shaq and Hess, is just a bit around how do we create this transparency, this kind of optionality and accessibility, so that people know and are more comfortable with ultimately what can be a long-term commitment financially in their lives. Shaq or Hess, feel free to chime right in.
Sure, I'll start, and maybe first I'll just add one comment to that. Like, you know, does that focus on an experience to enable that transparency even matter if you're in a hot market? Now, in maybe a tight market, we all acknowledge that definitely that makes a lot of sense. But even in a hot rental market in the UK over the last few years, just the nature of how that experience is built on rentals still means that, you know, landlords still ended up with 3 weeks of void in between tenancies, just because the experience is such that when you're an existing renter, you don't serve notice till the very last moment. The agent doesn't get to do any viewings till you moved out, and then, you know, people need to plan their move-in, still leading to a lot of cost efficiencies to actually serve the market. So just wanted to mention that. Now, in terms of transparency, like, I think the first thing to maybe explain, at least in the UK context, is like why is there an issue? So part of that is if you look at the life cycle of renting and the process, there's many stages, right? From listing a property to reserving it, doing the referencing, and then, you know, when you're moving in and managing the property and renewing and moving again, that entire system is really fragmented, where a renter, you know, they're interacting with an agent to make an offer. Sometimes that's over email, then they'll send them off to another platform to do lettings, to do the referencing, and, you know, if they need to buy any, you know, home insurance or anything related to the rentals, again, they're going off to another platform. There's so many different platforms a renter needs to use and an agent needs to use in the backend to manage that, but it's very difficult to unify that data and to present a clear, transparent view of all the actions they need to take, as well as, you know, the fully loaded cost of doing things. So that's part of that underlying problem that exists. And the reason why that's been really underserved is, like, the backbone of that, you know, of property management in the UK has been through kind of these legacy property management systems that really focused on how do you serve the landlords, and it's really an accounting-based database that served across multiple asset classes. So they really didn't have these, like, really custom flows to manage the rental journey. That's where the problem exists. How can we start to address that? I guess, like, the first question is, can you build a unified layer that helps bring those data sources into one place so that you can present it transparently? So that's probably step one. And then step two is, how do you then surface and make available that information so that renters, as well as landlords, agents, property managers, can make more informed choices. So that's, for me, like, the most important thing, and that's what kind of we had focused on delivering for the industry as well.
Yeah, in Hess, I'd love to hear, as Shaq mentioned, kind of this access to data, visibility. What are clients and customers, what are they missing? What aren't they seeing? And why is it so important that we start to have more visibility into information and data?
I think there's an underlying assumption within the market that people come to an agent ready to transact, right? And I have learned the hard way that we should really question that. What we're finding with our work is a lot of people essentially go through two separate steps. There is what I would call a decision-making step where you're almost on the property equivalent of browsing Instagram and going, oh, it looks like a really nice living room, right? You're essentially orienting yourself. And many people stay in that space for a long time. And if they're trying to buy in the UK in this market, it could be for years. Then there is the I am ready to transact step. And what we're running into, I feel, face first in this market is that the behavior required from the customer in the first sort of orientation step versus the I am ready to transact step are completely different. We're essentially asking people to really fundamentally switch gears. One is fun and the other one, let's be honest, it's not fun, right? If you're a customer, if you're a consumer of any kind, you have to apply for a mortgage, you have somebody going through your financials, you've got somebody going through your bank account and figuring out whether you can afford something, you have to hand over all of your personal details, you have to file your passports and everything else. It is an unfun experience. Let's just call it what it is. So I think the challenge within our market certainly is that the agent or realtor is on the front foot of sort of having to manage this transition that people are in from, hey, I'm seeing this beautiful home, I love it, oh my God, the lighting is beautiful and I love the ceiling and it's in such a great location and I think I can afford this, to, oh, let's get the solicitors involved. Let's get all of these things lined up. So when it comes to data, what we're observing is that a lot of these things that are tripping up the transaction process can very likely be brought forward into the funnel. So our view is really how many, let's look at how conversions are done. Let's look at how transactions are done. Let's say, for example, if you've got a listing, and you know from the landlord, you've got a landlord representing them, and the landlord will only accept professionals earning above a certain threshold. At this point in time, the way the market works is, we show this listing to everybody. So as an agent, you're then left filtering, and you're left with a very difficult decision where either you say, okay, I'm only going to focus on people who can afford this and essentially have the other people that I don't have time to respond to have what is in essence a poor experience with my brand, or I'm going to try and help everybody and get completely burned out because there's just not enough hours in the day, especially in, for example, times like August. In this market, August goes berserk because all of the students are renewing. So for us, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, okay, look, what is the data that's available to consumers and on the market generally to educate consumers about this property, whether or not it's the right fit for them and what they need to do ultimately to secure that property? Can we front load that data at the stage of application so that everything further downstream moves more easily? And I do agree with Shaq that having a central operating system to support all that is absolutely a really smart move. That's not really our focus. Our focus is not on building a central operating system, but fundamentally, I think there are these two pieces, right? There's a piece of getting your deal done, and there's a piece of maintaining your brand, because fundamentally, today's rental applicant could be tomorrow's person selling, right? Like they are potentially the same person.
So it sounds like it's not a matter of, it's a matter of efficiency for everyone involved in utilizing the data so that you can focus as an agent broker on the kind of the best leads and the ones that where you can make that experience kind of more well-rounded so that you have all the components early on to help guide and lead in the decision-making process, whether it be buying or renting.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And, I love this panel because we've got Shaq and Hess talking about this overall process, kind of lead generation, getting everybody through the transaction. Then we've got Alex has that component, but also this mortgage financial. And then we've got Jason with the insurance piece. And as we have previously chatted, all of these things need to come together for people to understand what it takes to ultimately get in a home. I'd love to hear more, Jason, maybe a bit from you around this transparency, optionality, accessibility, and a bit around Shaq and Hess have talked about kind of the overall process. And I love hearing because I think back and not to kind of boost our reach program, but we have this global program, and it's amazing because there are so many similarities, but there are also little things where we learn from each other. And at the end of the day, buying, selling, and renting properties is simply that. And how do we do better? And so it's so neat to just have this group come together. But anyway, sorry for the sidebar, Jason. I'd love to hear a bit about kind of, again, this, how does insurance tie into all this, and why should this be something that everyone's thinking about when it comes to a bit of the process that Shaq and Hess chatted about?
Right. So there's a predominant trend in the US where a renter or a home buyer gets online and starts looking at Zillow and what have you to start focusing on what their next location is going to be. And then they bring this to the real estate agent because there's still a need for a personal touch, right? Same on the insurance side, right? They will get online and try to understand. And what ends up happening is there's a resetting of expectations when they get into that professional dialogue. And Hess kind of touched on this a little bit. There's a bit of a, oh, I thought I could afford this, but the reality is I can afford 80% of it, right? And it's a oh shit moment, which nobody likes. I mean, let's be honest about it. And so we talk a lot about total cost of ownership because you're not putting in all these different pieces, right? And again, people rush through the process. They consolidated or condensed the process in this last wave because it was such a crazy frenzied market. And so they cut corners or what have you, or just wave things that over the period of, whether it's in Canada, 5 years or 30 years with a mortgage, you're taking a lot of risk and that can go up higher. So I'd say start with the transparency of the economics and get pre-qualified, right? Get locked in on your financial piece. I'd love to hear Alex's point on this in a moment. Get locked in on what you really can afford given your parameters and your risk appetite and blah, blah, blah. I think that's first and foremost. You can dream all you want by looking at Zillow and what have you. You still need a real estate professional to help negotiate it. Make sure you get down to a couple of properties that are the best choices for you based on whatever your criteria is and get the contract. Now, in the US, most real estate professionals are all about keys in hand, which is their incentive, right? We talked a little bit about this over the prep call. Their alignment with what they need to get done and your alignment as the home buyer or the renter are not fully aligned. It's like 80% aligned. I see Shaq nodding over there. The reality is that once they get contract in hand, they just focus on closing. And then in the US, they say, hey, you got to go get your lending squared up, right? You got to get your mortgage if you're financing. You got to go get your insurance to make sure that you have that for the lender. And then you've got to come with X, Y, and Z, which, as Hess was pointing out correctly, is really a lot of work in a condensed amount of time. In the US, you've got 5 to 7 days to do an inspection, the way, to get everything lined up, get all your mortgage, and then it's like 45 to 60 days for closing. So you've got all of this. And then on top of it, just as humans, we don't like change, right? You might, and it's a lot of pressure and stress. It's one of the most stressful things that you go through. So getting ahead of all of that with total cost of ownership, lining that all up, getting qualified professional, transparent real estate professional will help you. The good professionals are addressing all these things up front. In the US, one last story, and I'll turn back over to you, Dan. They were burying their heads about climate and climate-related risk on properties. You can't do that anymore. There was a study yesterday that came out about wildfire in the US. The entire map on the west coast was all red and inflamed, and over the next 30 years, it only gets worse. So, and it's a global issue, right? So, these are things that you can't look beyond. You have to address them up front, and you have to tackle them head on. And from an insurance point of view, you can get coverage. It's just going to be a matter of what the cost is going to be. So that's
Just
the
to jump on
important thing.
a quick point Jason made there that I think is really valuable to pick out is in this process, like, us as kind of PropTech are looking at how technology plays a role to make things better. I think it's really important acknowledging that real estate professionals have a really important role to help give the best outcome and experience to customers. And the way I see the role of our technology is to really simplify and unify the process so that the mundane tasks, so all of those are automated, so that they have the time to focus on the people who are relevant for that home and give them that best experience and ultimately drive good outcomes for both renter, a buyer, or the owner. And it's finding that right balance.
Yeah, Alex, I'd love to get you to part of this chat here, because what I think is unique about what you've been working on and what we've previously chatted about is, in addition to what everyone else has talked about, is just this education component. And how do you get a renter to become a buyer? How do they understand the overall process? And I know you've been working a lot on that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, because everything that we've talked about previously for you and what you're working on is all about this transparency piece and education and supporting people to understand the overall process and what it takes. So I'd love to hear more on your thoughts with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, no, I agree with you, Dan. It's been interesting to kind of, since we're almost covering like the entire like value cycle here with the client. So it's interesting to kind of go up and down it as we go. So yeah, really great points that everybody else has already made. I'll maybe just echo and add a couple things. So from our perspective, and I think what Jason mentioned of going, I find today's consumer does a lot of DIY. So whenever someone's coming to you, it's never like I have a blank slate that I'm going to work with and kind of educate them. If anything, it's actually harder because a lot of them come with misinformation or things that are maybe the wrong understanding of how something works. So you're not actually having to teach someone from scratch. You almost have to unteach them and then teach them, which is actually harder than if they came in knowing nothing. So that's one thing I'll start with, because you would not believe the amount of times I have the conversation where I'm like, well, why would I possibly want to own a mortgage? My rent is like $500 a month less. I'm like, yes, but your mortgage is principal and interest, and principal is your money. So it's like little things like that where it's like breaking it down to the customer. I think the first thing is framing the conversation. So understanding like, how can I explain this in a way that's going to make sense to you? What we find is a really good option is, if you were to go down these two paths, here's how much you're going to be worth 10 years from now under option A or option B. And then it's like an easier way to kind of distill the effect of housing gains that come through home ownership versus the cost of maintenance, the cost of financing versus the cost of rent increases, things like that, where you can then kind of illustrate like, here's how your net worth will accumulate over time. And then it helps you understand, or helps the client understand, what the implications are of both, rather than speaking to it maybe a bit more ambiguously of like, there's these benefits, it's like quantify it. Quantifying everything really helps make something more clear, I find, most of the time. So with us, that's really kind of what it is the first thing is framing. So you have to make them understand, like, why am I even interested in going down? Like, why would I care? If it's going to take me 2 years to buy and I'm currently renting, why do I need to care? It's like, well, here's the impact. And it's like, so step one is once you get them bought in. And then once they're bought in, it's a matter of how can I help you get there? So then that can be building a plan. That plan could be like, some people actually might even qualify today. They didn't even know they could. But you have some people that are maybe 6 months out, 12 months out, 18 months out. Putting together a plan and involving the right professionals is so key because it holds them accountable. So once they commit to a plan, they will have the incentive to kind of keep going. You have to keep them engaged. And it also helps because a big trend is also lead generation, as a lot of people have touched on. So let's say, for example, as a realtor, you're probably spending a lot of time getting leads and trying to nurture leads, but it's just natural that every single one of your leads isn't going to close. Some people are going to have to come later. So a lot of people then kind of, they slip through the cracks where they just kind of become second nature to the ones that you're focusing on that close now. So having a system in place where you can nurture not just the leads you have now, but almost building your future pipeline simultaneously is really key. And then that's something we focus on because we're trying to build a future pipeline that benefits us on the mortgage side, while also, let's say, benefiting on the transaction side for the realtor. So we both are trying to keep that client engaged.
It's interesting. So maybe think about what you're working on is not just getting a roof over somebody's head, but the financial aspects of it. And there's been lots of conversations around that. in terms of how agents and brokers, as we've talked about, look more holistically around the financial components and what it means to actually buy versus rent, because that's a critical component. Is the conversations we've seen across the globe is that's where most people build their wealth, is in home ownership. And how do you get there? And how do you see the fact that, to your point, Alex, that yeah, it may be a couple $100 more a month now, but what's the long-term benefit of having equity in your home and creating that wealth for you and your future? It's this huge component that I don't know if everybody fully understands. And it's interesting to hear you kind of work on helping people better engage and have this transparent conversation around what those differences are, to ultimately let them make the decision that's best for them, but at least they have all the options. Whereas it feels like in the past, they haven't. It's like, I'm either going to rent or I'm going to buy, and here's why. And people are kind of set in their ways to some degree. So
Yeah.
it's great.
And actually, one quick comment on what you just said.
Sure.
So and the biggest thing is transparency, because the answer wouldn't be like, because a lot of people are, especially the ones that have missed out on a lot of the parts of the housing market, are probably the most skeptical and hardest to convince that it is still like in their best interest. So sometimes I have people who will run my calculator and they'll be like, well, my rent is, 0 because I live in my parents' basement. So look, your calculator's saying I shouldn't buy. I'm like, well, it's true. Like, if you can live somewhere for free, then you actually shouldn't. It's cheaper for you to rent. But I'm like, but there's the qualitative element of you have to deal with your parents. So it's like, is that something that you can put a price on? So there honestly is, or even like misconceptions of, well, what if house prices are flat for the next 5 years? It's like, put in 0% HPI growth. It'll reduce how much the net benefit is, but it'll still show that you're like, this is still worth it. So helping people kind of wrap their heads around that is also really kind of impactful to get an idea of how much is the value of each option. I think it's super critical to be unbiased.
Can I just weigh in real quick? I think transparency is one piece of it. I think literacy is the other, right? So, there's a huge gap in financial literacy just all across the globe, right? Especially, again, back to this DIY life that we're all in, right? With the internet and communications, we've all become our own travel agents and librarians and financial advisors, et cetera. And to Alex's point, unteaching somebody is probably a bigger hurdle than just someone coming in fresh and going, hey, I need help.
Yeah, and one quick comment is I think over the past few years, there's been some dramatic changes in how people think about where they live and where they work.
Right.
And now you don't necessarily need to be in the same city that you work in. You can be more geographically mobile, so you're more likely to potentially, you may want to move more often. So baking in those transaction costs and understanding that has probably become more important than it ever was.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a bit like with this technology boom and access to data for clients, they're coming in with kind of these assumptions that maybe aren't always right or don't always have that full picture. And so having the ability to utilize other technology and resources and people to better understand that is so critical. And I'm hoping that there will be this shift where a few websites aren't necessarily the only ones who tell you what a house is worth and what the cost of ownership is, because many times that's not the case. Can I just jump in real quick? So the Zillow's Zestimate, I mean, that's the other piece too. You got to really double check your facts.
Yeah. And on that note, I think there's one thing that is pretty relevant to this room. I think with people DIYing, the willingness to pay for advice has gone through the floor, right? It's not just that we've all become our own travel agent, right? It's also our willingness to pay for a travel agent, unless they have fantastic marketing and really targeting a niche experience, has generally started going down. So there's ways around that with positioning. But I think on aggregates across the market, we see that unwillingness to pay. And I think it just sort of drives and underscores the need to bring down the cost of advice with technology. I'm not saying necessarily about my own technology, I'm just saying in general, you know, people are less willing to pay. So therefore, we need to find ways of servicing people with good advice at a cheaper rate. And that doesn't mean that we reduce the quality of our services, but it does mean that we should leverage technology to create efficiencies where possible, because as many people in the panel have pointed out, people are DIYing this. And because they're DIYing this, they're coming into the conversation thinking that they know everything already. So why would they pay you? And I think this is a genuine dynamic that we're seeing up and down the property market at the moment, as things are becoming, in some ways, less, and in other ways, I suppose, more opaque with misinformation.
It's a really good point, Hess, because many times I'll get the question of like, is technology going to replace what I do? And that's always a sensitive subject, right? Nobody wants to be replaced by technology. But I think in the real estate market, as we've chatted about, you need it. There's a human element that will always exist. It's a matter of if that human element is efficient and productive and has the right information to best educate and guide that consumer and client. That's ultimately what all of you are doing through the use of technology is figuring out how to make that a better experience for the client.
Yeah, like a quick comment on that, like buying your home or like renting your home, that's like the biggest decision you make and you literally live in it. I don't think we're gonna remove humans from that process, but the role of technology is to remove like the useless work. Like what's the point of sending 50 emails and, you know, having to, you know, send faxes and, you know, stuff like that. Like automate, create that simplicity, give time back to the professionals to engage, to add that value that they can. And I've just seen this in different industries that I've worked in, whether in food delivery or mobility at Uber. You know, there's a limit to that automation, and humans still have a very important role in that. And I think technology can allow you to focus and do the things that humans do best, which is, you know, real world contact, get context, and give, you know, that bespoke advice that makes material difference in people's lives.
Yeah. So we're coming up against our time here, and as I told you all on our prep call, the one thing I love to do, especially with a discussion like this, is what is the big takeaway? So if I'm listening to this right now, what should I go out and do? How can I have a positive impact other than obviously using your platforms? What is a positive impact I can do as a technologist in this space, as an investor, as agent or broker, anyone who participates in this real estate ecosystem? If there's one thing you want them to walk away with and be like, hey, I'm going to go change this, or I'm going to do this differently, what would it be? Alex, I'm going to start with you since I feel like I've left you going last every time. So I'm going to let you kick us off with this one.
No worries. It's I guess it's we just have to maintain our super polite stereotype, right? It's like, no, I'm kidding. So awesome. So one thing, and maybe just to kind of walk with, so I think one thing we talked a lot about in this conversation today is like a holistic relationship that you build with your clients. So honestly, it's always one of those things of you hear it from the panel, but the biggest thing is, I think what motivates action is if you hear it from your client. So take a look at just for fun, like take your CRM, take your funnel, take any of your lead sources and identify leads you had met less than 6 months ago that told you that you'd probably be ready within 6 months. And honestly, just call 5 of them that haven't closed yet, or even contacted you back in the last 6 months, and try to understand why. And then if you have past clients that you closed a home with, let's say 5 years ago, 5+ years ago, if you're not already doing your annual check-ins, call 5 of them again and see if they're still living there. Because I think what you'll find is that being able to nurture your future clients, your past clients, and your current clients is going to become more and more relevant to the element we all touched on, which is efficiency, but also cost effectiveness. Because acquiring those leads is either your time or your money, and you really need to be able to like monetize that to a higher degree. So yeah, I honestly would just say, like, my takeaway is audit your current funnel and just take a look at like where are the gaps in your workflow today, and seeing how can I improve it from there.
Great, thanks. Hess.
So I think on the whole, there's a whole bunch. Low cost things. Have a checklist for applicants, whether they're on the rental side or on the buy side, and consider sharing that checklist before they even do a viewing with you, just so that they have a clear vision of what they need to get ready in order to be successful within the process. In my experience, definitely on the sales side, we often spend a lot of time convincing people that they should love a particular home, and we focus an awful lot on the relationship and the price, and those are really great things to focus on. And then the person says, I'm ready to make an offer, and then everything sort of comes at you out of the dark. And if you're a first-time buyer, then essentially most of the time you're relying on your internet and not necessarily on the relationship with your agent to guide you through that process. And I think that is a problem, because if the agent flags it so far down the funnel, it can come across as being a very pressure and sort of unfriendly experience almost to first-time buyers, which is going to make them less likely to re-engage with your brand later. So I would say a simple thing to do is to just have a checklist. The other thing I would start doing is questioning whether volume is the right approach with sourcing applicants. I think a lot of people, definitely in our market, are very focused on volumes. If I just have lots and lots of applicants for this house, it will move faster. Obviously, logically, that's true, but it's also more work and usually more costs, right? You pay for that volume. So query whether that is useful. And finally, to Alex's point and to Jacques' point as well, people are moving around more. So yeah, beyond calling people who purchased from you 5 years ago and saying, hey, are you still living there? Maybe ask them, instead of selling, would you consider renting out? Because a lot of people are thinking about moving to new locations, are exploring living outside, if you're in the UK, for example, London, but they're not necessarily ready to buy in, a new area. And they're not necessarily going to get the same bang for buck that they had on their first time home with the way the interest rates are changing. So I think consider creating some optionality for the people you call back, rather than sort of defaulting to the old, let's sell this house and get you a new one playbook.
Great, thanks. And then Jason, I'm gonna hop over to you.
So for me, I think it piggybacks on both Alex and Hess is the total cost of ownership, right? And having some sort of calculator there that looks at it as dollars, but also percentages. I think that starts with the transparency. Understanding what home you can afford or your clients can afford is number one. And looking at it with a cold stone sober view of it, right? So that provides a realistic framework then to look at optionality. I think people, especially in some markets where the insurance costs are relatively high, will be surprised at how much insurance is the percentage of the total. For example, in the United States, in Florida, while there's no personal property tax in the state of Florida, that's why a lot of people are moving there. The insurance costs are so high. Sometimes the insurance cost is higher than the mortgage costs in a month. I mean, it's crazy. It's that inverted. So again, total cost of ownership. And to piggyback on Shaq's point, the last point I'll make is 85%, we believe, can be done by data and process and systems. A lot of that old paperwork, laborious, that all can get washed away with technology. That 15% is that added value of that trusted advisor. That's the difference in the difference.
Thanks. Shaq.
Cool. So a lot to take away about, maybe if you focus on just a few. If there's any technologists here, I think a key piece of advice, if you really want to remove that fragmentation and enable that transparency, we need to build that together to be more open and transparent around how data is structured, and perhaps as an industry work towards more standardization of data protocols. So that's one for the technologists. For the realtors, the agents, the property managers, and institutional owners, I think the first big takeaway is there's not a trade-off between providing a better experience and your cost. In fact, it's the opposite. By embracing technology and providing a better experience, you can actually embrace efficiencies, reduce costs, and in fact, open up new revenue channels. For example, looking at embedded finance and participating in the upside of enabling those really interesting things. Yeah, so those for me are maybe the key takeaways. The way things are or were should not be holding us back from looking at what's coming. And we're heading into really interesting and difficult times, but sometimes that, that adversity helps breed creativity and unlocks a new wave of innovation and possibilities that we should keep an open mind on.
Yeah, so much opportunity. So I just jotted down as you all spoke the top takeaways. So regroup, audit, listen to your clients, have a checklist and share it early and often. Is volume the right approach? Think about that. Total cost of ownership and dollar and percentage amount. And then build tech together, share data, and it will help make the ecosystem more efficient, transparent, and better place. And what I love about all those, I think it was 4 or 5 things, is we're all here and it's all about this customer experience, which is where we started this conversation off. And so I want to end with that. I want to thank all of you for the time. I hope everyone watching enjoyed this. I assume we're all LinkedIn users, so if you want to reach out to us, find us on LinkedIn. We're happy to connect and chat more. So again, thanks to Global PropTech, thanks to the Reach UK program specifically, and thanks to all of you for participating today. Hope you enjoyed it. Enjoy the rest of your day and hope to chat with some of you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dan, for moderating.
Thanks, Dan. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.